He stood there, confused and alone in the vast marble foyer of that towering Manhattan penthouse. A man swallowed by silence he couldn't escape. The expensive suit hung on him like a costume too heavy to wear. But I was just the maid. Maybe you're working for someone who never says thank you, or cleaning up while everyone else sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I promise today's story will touch your heart. My name is Fatima, and for 8 long years I scrubbed the floors of the Whitmore family's penthouse on Fifth Avenue. That morning started like any other. I wore my usual gray uniform that smelled of lemon polish and carried the weight of invisible tears. The fabric was thin from too many washings, and my hands were cracked from cleaning solutions that promised to make everything shine except my own spirit. I remember the sound my worn shoes made against the Italian marble as I moved through rooms larger than entire apartments in Queens. Each step echoed like a question I was afraid to ask. Am I seen? Do I matter? The tall windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering views of Central Park that cost more per month than I earned in a year. But I wasn't allowed to linger and look. I was furniture with breath, moving from room to room, erasing traces of lives I could never touch. The doorman, Miguel, buzzed from downstairs. His voice crackled through the intercom like distant thunder. A visitor was coming up, someone the family wasn't expecting. Mrs. Whitmore, draped in silk that cost more than my rent, barely glanced at me as she adjusted her pearl necklace. Her husband, Richard, was already lost in his phone, scrolling through stock market numbers that danced in green and red across his screen. Their wealth seemed endless, built on investments that multiplied like rabbits in the digital world of cryptocurrency and traditional assets. The elevator doors opened with a whisper, and he stepped out. Tall, maybe 60, with silver-touched hair and eyes that held stories I couldn't read. He looked around the penthouse like a man seeing ghosts. His hands shook slightly, and when Mrs. Whitmore approached him with her practiced smile, he stepped back as if her words were thorns. He spoke in Arabic, soft and desperate, but the family stood frozen like expensive statues. They didn't understand. They just stared with the blank politeness wealthy people wear when poor countries knock on their door. I watched from the kitchen doorway, my heart recognizing something familiar in his confusion. I had been that lost before, speaking words no one wanted to hear. Without thinking, I walked toward him with a silver tray and a cup of fresh coffee. The porcelain clinked softly against the silver, and I offered it to him, while speaking the Arabic my grandmother taught me in the cramped apartment, where I learned that kindness costs nothing but means everything. I told him he was welcome, that the coffee was hot, and asked if he needed anything else. His eyes filled with tears. He took the cup with hands that trembled not from age but from relief. He answered me in Arabic, thanking me, telling me his name was Khalil, and that he had been searching for this family for 23 years. The Whitmores watched in shock as I translated his words, their faces shifting from confusion to something that looked like fear. But let me go back to the beginning, because every story of liberation starts with a cage you don't even know you're in. I came to New York 12 years ago from a small town in North Carolina where dreams grow wild but opportunities don't. My husband had died in a factory accident, and I needed work that could support my son Omar and send money to my mother who cleaned hotels for tourists who never remembered her name. The employment agency on Roosevelt Avenue promised me a good family, people who would appreciate dedication and honesty. The Whitmore family seemed perfect on paper. Richard Whitmore had built a fortune through real estate investments and stock market magic that turned numbers into millions. His portfolio included everything from traditional blue-chip stocks to the newest cryptocurrencies that promised wealth as endless as the Manhattan skyline. Elizabeth Whitmore came from old money, the kind that whispers instead of shouts and measures worth in social connections rather than bank statements. Their daughter, Catherine, was studying at Columbia, preparing to inherit not just money but the art of looking through people like they were windows. Their son, James, lived in Los Angeles, managing the family's West Coast investments with the casual cruelty that comes from never having to choose between rent and groceries. I was hired to maintain their world, to polish surfaces that already gleamed and organize lives that already sparkled with artificial perfection. The salary seemed generous until I realized it came with invisible taxes. The tax of being available 24 hours a day. The tax of smiling when spoken to like a pet. The tax of watching my own son grow up through pixelated video calls while I raised other people's children with leftover love. My room was in the basement, smaller than their walk-in closets but larger than anything I had ever called my own. The walls were white and thin, and at night I could hear the building's heartbeat through the pipes, water running, elevators humming, the city breathing around me like a giant that never slept. I sent most of my salary home. Omar needed school clothes, books, tutoring to help him become what I could never be. My mother needed medicine for arthritis that attacked her hands the way poverty attacks hope. I kept barely enough for subway cards and the cheapest groceries, eating meals from ingredients the Whitmores would throw away. Those first years blurred together like seasons seen through dirty windows. I memorized their schedules better than my own dreams. Richard woke at 5:30, requiring coffee strong enough to wake the dead and newspapers ironed flat as truth. Elizabeth needed her orange juice fresh squeezed and her vitamins arranged in order of importance. Catherine wanted her rebellion served with organic rebellion, and her homework help delivered with invisible effort. I learned their bodies' languages before I learned their hearts' secrets. Richard's shoulders tensed when the stock market dipped. Elizabeth's voice grew sharper when her friends canceled lunch plans. Catherine's room became a disaster when boys didn't call back. I absorbed their moods like a sponge absorbs spills, cleaning up emotional messes they pretended didn't exist. But it was the small cruelties that cut deepest. The way Elizabeth would say, "Just make sure it's perfect this time," as if I had never gotten anything right. The way Richard would hand me his credit card statements to file, letting me see numbers that represented more money than I would earn in a lifetime, as if my poverty was entertainment for his wealth. The way Catherine would introduce me to her friends as our helper, reducing 8 years of dedicated service to 3 small words that made me disappear. I missed Omar's first day of high school because Elizabeth needed help preparing for a charity gala that raised money for underprivileged children. The irony tasted bitter as the wine I served to guests who thought generosity meant writing checks while ignoring the woman who polished their glasses. I missed his school plays, his soccer games, his 16th birthday because the Whitmore family's needs always came first, and I had learned to make myself small enough to fit in the spaces between their priorities. When Omar called to tell me about his acceptance to community college, I cried in the supply closet between the bleach and the furniture polish. He had done it without me there to help with applications or scholarship essays. He had become someone I barely recognized from our brief weekend visits, a young man who spoke about his future with excitement I hadn't felt in years. "Mom," he would say during our Sunday phone calls, "why don't you come home? I'm old enough to take care of myself now." But I couldn't explain how fear had wrapped around me like chains made of monthly bills and empty bank accounts, how leaving felt like jumping off a cliff when you've forgotten how to fly, how the Whitmores had become my prison and my security, and I couldn't tell the difference anymore. The microaggressions came daily like small cuts that never quite healed. Richard's brother, Marco, visited monthly, a man who measured his worth by how poorly he could treat those who served him. He would snap his fingers when he needed something, as if I were a dog trained to fetch. Once, he accused me of flirting with Richard because I had brought him coffee without being asked. "Why are you always hovering around him?" Marco said, loud enough for Elizabeth to hear. "What are you trying to prove?" The family laughed, but their laughter felt like stones thrown at glass. I learned to make myself smaller, to anticipate needs without being present, to exist in the negative spaces of their lives. They forgot to pay me on time regularly, as if my bills could wait for their convenience. When I finally gathered courage to mention it, Elizabeth would sigh dramatically and remind me how fortunate I was to have such a stable position, as if gratitude could pay for subway cards and groceries and the small amounts I sent home to keep my family alive. One winter day, I got sick with flu that made my bones ache and my head spin. I called in the morning to explain I couldn't work, but Elizabeth's response was a cold silence, followed by, "Well, I suppose we'll have to manage somehow." No one asked if I needed anything. No one checked if I was eating or had medicine. I was sick alone in my basement room for 3 days, listening to the Whitmore family's life continue above me as if I had never existed. When I returned, weak and hollow-eyed, a sandwich was missing from the refrigerator, and I was blamed for poor inventory control. The accusation stung worse than the fever had, because it reminded me that I was presumed guilty of any imperfection in their perfect world. The breaking point came on a Thursday in March. I was polishing the dining room table, the massive mahogany piece that seated 12 and cost more than a car. My hands were raw from cleaning solutions, and my back ached from bending. The spring light streamed through the tall windows, highlighting every fingerprint and water spot that dared to exist on surfaces that demanded perfection. I was tired. Tired in my bones, tired in my soul, tired in places that sleep couldn't reach. As I reached for the crystal centerpiece to clean underneath, my grip slipped. The piece fell, shattering against the marble floor like my heart had shattered years ago in tiny pieces I kept stepping on. The sound brought Elizabeth running, her heels clicking against the floor like countdown timer. She stared at the broken crystal, then at me, her face cycling through shock, anger, and disappointment. "That was my grandmother's," she said quietly, which somehow hurt more than screaming would have. "It's irreplaceable." I stood among the shards, feeling smaller than the smallest piece of broken glass. I apologized, offered to pay for it somehow, promised to be more careful. But Elizabeth just shook her head and walked away, leaving me to clean up the evidence of my imperfection. That night, I sat on my narrow bed and stared at a family photo on my dresser. Omar smiling at his 8th grade graduation, my mother standing proud beside him, me absent from the frame because I had been working. I realized I had become a ghost in my own life, present only in other people's stories, invisible in my own. I opened my dresser drawer and pulled out the suitcase I had hidden there years ago. I had packed it during my 2nd year with the Whitmores, during a week when homesickness felt like drowning. But I had never had the courage to close the latches and walk away. That night, I closed it without locking it, a promise to myself that departure was possible. I took my old uniform, the one from my first day, and burned it in the basement's utility sink. The fabric curled and blackened, and I watched 8 years of invisible service disappear into smoke. Then I found the letter I had written to Elizabeth 6 months earlier, a resignation letter that explained my value and requested respect. I had never sent it because courage is expensive, and I had spent all mine on survival. That night, I tore it into pieces and scattered them like snow that melts before it reaches the ground. The next morning, something had changed in me. I woke up before my alarm, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see the sunrise through my basement window. The light was pale and weak, but it was light nonetheless. And I had forgotten that mornings could hold promise instead of just obligation. I served Richard his coffee without the usual deference. I cleaned Elizabeth's bathroom without the usual invisible tears. When Catherine complained about my pace, I looked her in the eye instead of at the floor and said, "I'm working as carefully as I can." The family noticed immediately, the way you notice when furniture moves slightly and the room feels different. Elizabeth's smiles became sharper. Catherine's complaints grew louder. Richard started timing how long tasks took, as if my efficiency were a stock he could trade. "You've been distant lately," Catherine said one afternoon as I changed her sheets. "Cold." I stopped tucking the corners and looked at her, really looked at her. She was 22, beautiful in the way money makes possible, but her eyes held the emptiness that comes from never having to work for anything. I felt sorry for her, which surprised me. For 8 years I had envied her privilege. Now I pitied her poverty of spirit. "I've been the same," I said quietly. "Maybe you're just noticing me for the first time." She stared at me with the same confusion she might show a talking lamp, as if the furniture had suddenly developed opinions. The conversation ended there, but something had started that couldn't be stopped. It was Mrs. Kim from 7B who saved me, though she never knew it. I met her in the elevator one evening, coming home from another endless day of erasing my presence from other people's lives. She was small and elderly, with silver hair and eyes that held decades of grace. Her apartment was directly above mine, and sometimes I could hear her moving around, living a quiet life that seemed to have room for peace. "You look tired, dear," she said as we rode down together. Her voice was gentle, with traces of an accent I couldn't place. "Are you taking care of yourself?" The question startled me. No one had asked about my welfare in so long that I had forgotten it was possible. I mumbled something about long hours, but she nodded with understanding that went deeper than words. "I was a teacher for 42 years, she said. "I know what it looks like when someone gives so much of themselves that there's nothing left. Be careful not to disappear completely." She got off at the ground floor, but her words rode with me to the basement. That night, I looked in the bathroom mirror and saw what she had seen. My eyes were hollow, my skin gray with fatigue, my shoulders curved inward as if I were trying to take up as little space as possible. I had been disappearing, one day of invisible service at a time. The first act of rebellion was small, but felt enormous. The next weekend, I didn't send money home. For 8 years, I had transferred most of my paycheck to Omar and my mother on Friday afternoons, keeping barely enough for survival. That Friday, I kept the money. I spent Saturday in Central Park, something I had never done despite living across the street from it for years. I bought a coffee from a vendor and sat on a bench, watching families play and couples walk and people live lives that included leisure. The coffee was bitter and perfect, and I drank it slowly, tasting freedom in every sip. Omar called that Sunday, asking about the money transfer. My heart pounded as I explained I was keeping it this week, that I needed time to think about my future. He was quiet for a moment, then said something that changed everything. "Mom, I've been working part-time at a restaurant. I have some savings. You don't have to send money if you need it for yourself. When's the last time you bought yourself something just because you wanted it?" I couldn't remember. For so many years, my wants had been buried under other people's needs that I couldn't even identify them anymore. After we hung up, I walked to the bank and checked my balance. I had saved more than I realized, small amounts that had accumulated into something substantial. Not a fortune, but enough to make choices. That realization was intoxicating and terrifying. Choice requires courage, and courage requires believing you deserve better than what you've accepted. The changes started small. I refused to work on my day off, even when Elizabeth scheduled a dinner party and implied I was being selfish. I left at 6 o'clock instead of staying until every dish was perfect and every surface gleamed. I bought groceries for myself, real food instead of whatever the Whitmores discarded, and cooked meals in the building's common kitchen. Mrs. Kim found me there one evening, stirring a pot of soup that smelled like home and childhood and possibilities. She sat beside me without invitation and shared stories about students she had taught, children who had grown into adults who sent her Christmas cards and graduation photos. "You have kind eyes," she told me as we ate soup together, "but they're sad. What would make them happy?" The question hung in the air like incense, settling into spaces I had kept closed for years. I thought about Omar, about my mother, about the woman I had been before service became servitude. I thought about dreams I had buried so deep I couldn't remember what they looked like. The Whitmores noticed my withdrawal like a fever notices medicine. Elizabeth scheduled a family meeting, which meant summoning me to the living room where I had cleaned and served but never sat. The furniture was arranged like a courtroom, with me standing in the defendant's position while they sat in judgment. "We need to talk about your attitude lately," Elizabeth began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been refused. "You've been distant, almost defiant." Richard nodded from behind his tablet, where stock prices scrolled like prayers to the god of endless accumulation. "We've given you a good position, stable income, health insurance. Many people would be grateful for this opportunity." Catherine joined the chorus, her voice carrying entitlement like perfume. "We've always treated you like family." The word family hit me like a physical blow. Family. I looked around the room where I had spent 8 years moving like a shadow, cleaning surfaces they touched, but never being invited to sit on furniture I maintained. I thought about real family, about Omar growing up without me, about my mother aging alone, about love that asked for presence, not perfection. Family? The word came out of my mouth before I could stop it, carrying 8 years of swallowed protests. "When did you last ask about my son, my mother? When did you include me in holiday celebrations I helped prepare? When did you see me as anything more than someone who makes your life easier?" The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. They stared at me with the shock of furniture suddenly developing opinions, of services suddenly demanding recognition, of invisible people suddenly taking up space. I walked to the man machine where family photos smiled in silver frames. I had polished those frames hundreds of times, knowing every face except my own. I picked up the largest photo, their holiday portrait from last Christmas, taken while I worked in the kitchen preparing the meal they would eat while I cleaned. "This is your family," I said, placing the photo on the coffee table. Beautiful, wealthy, perfect. But I was never in it, was I? I was here, but I was never included. I was family when you needed something, but not when you celebrated having everything. Elizabeth's face cycled through emotions like seasons changing too fast. Surprise, anger, fear, calculation. "You're being emotional," she said finally. "Let's discuss this rationally." But I was done with rational discussions that started with my gratitude and ended with my silence. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the spare keys to their penthouse, keys I had carried for 8 years, like a sacred trust. I placed them on the table beside the family photo. "I'm giving my notice," I said, and the words felt like the first breath after drowning. 2 weeks from today will be my last day. Richard looked up from his tablet, finally seeing me as something more than background noise. "This is very sudden. Perhaps we can discuss a raise. Additional benefits. Money. Always money. As if my worth could be calculated in dollars and my dignity could be purchased with benefits." I thought about the fortune they had accumulated through investments and cryptocurrency trading, wealth that multiplied while I remained poor, not because I didn't work hard enough, but because I had been taught to be grateful for crumbs. "It's not about money," I said. "It's about being seen." I walked out of the room before they could respond, before crying could compromise the strength I had finally found. In my basement room, I sat on my narrow bed and called Omar. "I did it," I told him, and my voice shook with fear and exhilaration. "I quit." "Mom," he said, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. "I'm proud of you. Come home." Home. The word held promises I had forgotten existed. But the story wasn't over. The Whitmores had one more surprise for me, arriving in the form of a confused man who spoke a language they couldn't understand and carried secrets that would change everything. It was my last week working for the Whitmores when the doorman called up about the unexpected visitor. I was in the kitchen cleaning surfaces that would be dirty again within hours when I heard the elevator doors open and footsteps hesitate on the marble floor. I looked through the doorway and saw him, tall and distinguished, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't hide his uncertainty. He spoke in Arabic to Elizabeth, words flowing like water seeking earth, but she just smiled her practiced hostess smile and gestured helplessly. Something in his posture reminded me of Omar during his first day of school. brave on the surface but frightened underneath. I watched the Whitmores surround him like well-dressed vultures, offering seats and drinks while understanding nothing he said. They were performing hospitality while missing its essence entirely. I prepared coffee the way my grandmother taught me, strong and sweet and offered with genuine care. I carried it to him on a silver tray that had reflected my face thousands of times, but never my worth. When I spoke to him in Arabic, his eyes filled with tears of relief. "Thank God," he whispered in Arabic, taking my hands as if I were salvation. "I have been looking for this family for 23 years. My name is Khalil al-Rashid." The name meant nothing to me, but as I translated his words to the Whitmores, I watched their faces change. Elizabeth went pale beneath her expensive makeup. Richard's hands tightened around his tablet until his knuckles went white. Catherine stepped backward as if the man carried contagion. "Tell him we don't know what he's talking about," Elizabeth said quickly, but her voice shook like leaves in wind. Khalil heard the fear in her tone even without understanding the words. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio, worn soft with age and handling. Inside were papers, photographs, documents that looked official and important. "Please," he said to me in Arabic, "tell them I am the son of Amina al-Rashid. She worked for the Whitmore family's business in Dubai 24 years ago. Before she died, she told me about the partnership, about the money that was supposed to be held in trust for me." I translated his words. Watching the Whitmores' carefully constructed composure crumble like walls built on sand. Elizabeth exchanged glances with Richard that spoke volumes in a language I had learned to read during 8 years of observing their private communications. "Tell him he must be mistaken," Richard said, but his voice carried the hollow sound of lies wearing thin. "We have no business connections in Dubai." But I had seen their financial statements while filing. I had noticed the offshore accounts, the international investments, the cryptocurrency holdings that moved money across borders like digital ghosts. I had processed documents with Arabic letterheads, cleaned offices where maps of the Middle East hung on walls, answered phones from callers whose accents matched Khalil's. Khalil opened his portfolio and showed me documents that made his claim clear: bank statements, business partnerships, investment records, and photos of a young woman who shared his eyes, standing beside a younger version of Richard Whitmore in what looked like a Dubai office. "This is my mother," he said, pointing to the woman in the photograph. "She invested her life savings in a business partnership with Mr. Whitmore's company. When she became pregnant, they promised to hold my inheritance in trust until I came of age. But when I tried to contact them 23 years ago, they had disappeared. It has taken me this long to find them." I translated his story while watching the Whitmores realize their past had caught up with their present. The documents Khalil showed spoke of millions in oil investment profits, cryptocurrency gains, real estate development returns, money that had grown over 2 decades into a fortune that could have changed his life, but had instead funded theirs. "These are forgeries," Elizabeth said desperately, but her husband was reading the documents with the recognition of someone seeing familiar signatures and official seals. Richard's financial empire had been built on more than smart investing. It included partnerships and opportunities that belonged to others, profits that should have been shared but were instead absorbed. Khalil's inheritance had funded the penthouse, where I had worked like a servant, the luxury that had surrounded me like a cage, while the rightful owner searched for justice across continents. I found myself in the strange position of being translator between oppressor and oppressed, between stolen wealth and its rightful owner. For 8 years I had cleaned the surfaces of a life funded by theft, served meals paid for with someone else's dreams. Catherine tried a different approach. Even if these documents are real, which we don't acknowledge, the statute of limitations would have run out years ago. But Khalil smiled sadly and pulled out one more document, a legal paper that made Elizabeth gasp and Richard drop his tablet. "I hired international lawyers 6 months ago," Khalil said through me. They have been investigating the financial trail. Cryptocurrency transactions never disappear, they said. Digital receipts last forever. They have traced every Bitcoin transfer, every stock dividend, every real estate profit that grew from my mother's original investment. The fortune the Whitmores lived on wasn't just theirs. It was built on a foundation of someone else's trust and dreams, multiplied over decades into wealth that could have lifted entire communities from poverty. Instead, it had funded their isolation, their indifference, their treatment of people like me as invisible equipment necessary for maintaining their stolen comfort. But Khalil surprised everyone, including me, with what he said next. "I don't want all of it," he explained as I translated. "I want justice, recognition, and enough to help my own community back home. But I also want to understand how you lived with this secret for 24 years. How you spent money that didn't belong to you while my mother died, believing she had secured her son's future." The room fell silent except for the sound of Elizabeth's jewelry clinking as her hands trembled. Richard stared at his tablet's dark screen as if stock prices could provide answers to moral questions. Catherine looked between her parents like a child realizing her heroes were actually villains. I stood in the middle of this revelation, holding translation between languages and justice between worlds. For 8 years, I had been invisible to this family. Now I was the only bridge between their past sins and present reckoning. That evening, after Khalil left with promises to return with lawyers and translators, the Whitmores tried desperately to control the narrative. They offered him money to disappear. They threatened legal action. They claimed the documents were forgeries designed to extort them. But I had seen truth in Khalil's eyes, the same truth I recognized in my own story. The truth of being forgotten by people who had profited from your existence. The truth of having your worth reduced to usefulness while your humanity became invisible. They tried to buy my silence too, offering me bonuses and raise to keep their family secrets private. But I was already leaving. Their secrets would leave with me, not because I owed them loyalty, but because I owed myself dignity. The night before my last day, Mrs. Kim invited me to her apartment for tea. Her home was small but filled with light, lived-in furniture that held memories instead of displaying wealth. Photographs covered the walls, students and family, and moments that mattered more than monetary value. "You look different," she observed as we sat by her window overlooking the park. "Lighter." I told her about quitting, about going home to Omar, about feeling scared and free simultaneously. I couldn't tell her about Khalil or the family's secrets, but I could share my own liberation. "Fear and freedom often look identical at first glance," she said wisely. "The difference is in the direction you're walking. Are you walking toward something or running away from something?" I considered her question through sleepless hours. I was doing both, I realized. Running away from invisibility and toward visibility, running away from other people's dreams and toward my own dreams, running away from servitude and toward service that honored both giver and receiver. My last morning with the Whitmores began before sunrise. I made their coffee one final time, cleaned their kitchen until it gleamed, organized their lives one last time so perfectly that my absence would be immediately obvious. I left detailed instructions for my replacement if they could find someone willing to work for people who confused helplessness with cruelty. Elizabeth tried one last manipulation as I packed my few belongings. She appeared in the basement with crocodile tears and desperate promises. "You've been like family to us," she said, using that word again like a weapon disguised as affection. "Surely we can work something out, a raise, additional vacation time, better health insurance." I looked at her standing in my basement room, probably the first time she had ever descended to see where I lived. The space was small and bare, furnished with cast-offs from their redecorating projects. For 8 years, they had walked above my head while I slept below their feet, invisible until they needed something. "Family doesn't live in basements," I said quietly. Family doesn't get forgotten when paydays are late. Family doesn't get blamed for broken treasures or accused of flirting or treated like expensive appliances. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up my hand. You gave me a job, and I gave you 8 years of my life. We're even. I walked past her and up the basement stairs for the last time, carrying my single suitcase and 8 years of memories I was finally ready to leave behind. Richard waited by the front door with an envelope, presumably my final paycheck. He handed it to me with the awkward formality of someone who had never learned how to say thank you or goodbye to people he considered beneath notice. I hope you'll be discreet about family matters, he said, confirming that my suspicions about his guilt were correct. I took the envelope without opening it. Your family matters were never my business, I said. My family matters are finally going to be. The elevator doors closed behind me like curtains falling on a play I had never wanted to star in, but instead of applause, I heard only silence and the mechanical hum of machinery carrying me away from 8 years of invisible service toward an uncertain but visible future. Omar met me at LaGuardia Airport, taller than I remembered and smiling with pride that had nothing to do with money or status. He hugged me like I was precious, like I mattered, like my presence was gift enough. We drove through Queens toward the apartment he had found for me, small but bright, with windows that let in light and walls that had room for photographs of people I loved. I saved money from the restaurant job, he told me as we sat in traffic that felt like freedom compared to the marble silence of the Whitmore penthouse. Enough for first month's rent and security deposit. I figured you'd want to choose your own furniture, paint the walls whatever colors make you happy. When had anyone last asked what made me happy? I couldn't remember. For so many years, happiness had been other people's achievement, something I facilitated but never experienced directly. The apartment was on the second floor of a building filled with families who knew each other's names and borrowed cups of sugar and looked out for each other's children. My neighbors worked jobs that paid by the hour instead of by the year, but they worked with dignity intact and humanity recognized. Mrs. Rodriguez next door brought me rice and beans on my first night, staying to chat about her grandchildren and asking about my son with genuine interest. Mr. Chen from downstairs helped me move my few belongings upstairs, refusing payment but accepting gratitude with the grace of someone who understood the difference. I planted basil and mint on the kitchen windowsill, green shoots reaching toward light like hope taking root. The herbs grew wild and fragrant, nothing like the controlled arrangements I had maintained in the Whitmore penthouse. These plants grew because they wanted to live, not because someone demanded perfection. Most mornings I woke before dawn from habit, then remembered I had nowhere to be, no one to serve, no floors to polish before anyone else's day began. The silence felt foreign at first, absence of emergency instead of presence of peace. I had to learn the difference between loneliness and solitude, between emptiness and space for possibility. I enrolled in a community college program for human services, thinking I might become a social worker or counselor. I wanted to work with dignity, to serve people who needed help rather than convenience, to be visible in my usefulness instead of invisible despite it. My classmates were immigrants and working mothers and people starting over after circumstances they couldn't control. We studied together in the library, shared coffee in the cafeteria, formed friendships based on mutual respect rather than mutual need. For the first time in years, I had conversations where people asked my opinion and listened to my answers. Omar visited every weekend, bringing laundry and stories about his classes and plans for the future that included me as mother rather than financial support system. We cooked meals together, watched movies, talked about dreams we had both been too tired to dream during the years when survival took all our energy. "You're different, Mom," he said one Saturday as we walked through Flushing Meadows Park, calmer but stranger at the same time. "Like you finally have room to be yourself." I thought about his observation as we sat by the lake, watching families have picnics and children feed ducks and couples hold hands like love was simple. I was different. The woman who had whispered through marble halls and apologized for existing had been replaced by someone who spoke at normal volume and took up space without apologies. Sometimes I checked online news about the Whitmore family, wondering if Khalil had pursued his legal case or if they had managed to buy their way out of consequences as rich people often do. I found a small article buried in the business section about settlement negotiations involving cryptocurrency fraud and international investment disputes, but no details that satisfied my curiosity. I hoped Khalil had found justice, or at least recognition. I hoped the Whitmores had learned something about the difference between earning money and stealing it, between building wealth and inheriting theft, but mostly I hoped they would treat their next housekeeper better than they had treated me, though I doubted change came easily to people who had spent decades practicing indifference. 6 months after leaving the penthouse, I was walking through my neighborhood when I saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench outside the subway station. Mrs. Kim, reading a book in the afternoon sun, looking exactly as wise and gentle as she had in our brief elevator encounters. "Fatima!" She looked up as I approached, her face lighting with genuine pleasure. "How wonderful to see you! You look beautiful." Beautiful. When had anyone last called me beautiful? I sat beside her on the bench, grateful for her presence in this new chapter of my life. "I live in Queens now," I told her. "I'm studying to become a counselor, working with immigrant families who need help navigating systems I understand too well." She nodded approvingly. "Good work, important work. Work that sees you while you help others be seen." We watched the neighborhood around us, people coming home from jobs and school, families gathering for dinner, life happening at human speed rather than marble speed. Mrs. Kim told me she was volunteering at a literacy center, teaching English to adults who reminded her of former students. "The Whitmores asked about you," she mentioned casually. "Elizabeth ran into me in the lobby last month. She seemed surprised you hadn't kept in touch." I thought about this information, turning it over like a stone examined for value. The idea that they expected continued contact after 8 years of treating me like expensive furniture felt typical of their inability to understand basic human relationships. "Did you tell her anything about me?" Mrs. Kim smiled mysteriously. I told her that people bloom when they're finally planted in good soil. As winter approached, I completed my first semester with grades that surprised me. I had forgotten I was intelligent, that I could learn new ideas and write papers and participate in discussions with insights worth hearing. My professors treated me like a student rather than a servant, valuing my perspective rather than just my productivity. One evening while studying for finals, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice was familiar but unexpected. "Fatima, this is Khalil al-Rashid. I got your number from the community center where someone said you help translate for refugee families." My heart jumped, remembering the man whose Arabic I had understood when the Whitmores couldn't, whose inheritance claim had exposed their financial foundation. "How did your legal case go?" I asked in Arabic, grateful to speak my grandmother's language with someone who shared it. "Settled out of court," he said, and I could hear satisfaction in his voice. "Not everything I deserved, but enough to fund the school I want to build in my mother's name. Enough to make sure other people's children get the education she never received." He told me about his plans, a technical school in Jordan that would train young people for jobs in the growing solar energy industry, clean technology funded by recycled justice, opportunity created from recovered theft. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "not just for translating that day, but for treating me like a human being when I was confused and frightened. The Whitmores offered me coffee like a business transaction. You offered it like a gift." After we hung up, I sat in my small apartment surrounded by my criminal justice textbooks and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride. Not pride in what I had accumulated or achieved, but pride in who I had been during a moment when choices mattered. I had been kind to a stranger when no one was watching. I had spoken up for truth when lies were more convenient. I had chosen dignity over dollars and humanity over habit. These choices hadn't made me wealthy, but they had made me whole. Christmas that year was different from any I had experienced during the Whitmore years. Instead of working while others celebrated, I hosted dinner in my small apartment. Omar brought his girlfriend, a nursing student, whose eyes lit up when she talked about helping premature babies survive and thrive. Mrs. Rodriguez came with her grandchildren, filling my space with laughter that had nothing to do with performance or propriety. We ate food I had cooked with pleasure instead of obligation, shared stories that included everyone instead of excluding help, gave gifts that meant something besides expense. When we cleaned up afterward, everyone helped, and the work felt like community rather than service. Standing in my kitchen that night, washing dishes while Omar dried and his girlfriend put away leftovers and Mrs. Rodriguez's grandchildren drew pictures at my table, I realized this was what family actually looked like. Not perfect people in photographed moments, but imperfect people choosing to show up for each other's imperfect lives. I thought about the Whitmores spending Christmas in their marble perfection, probably missing the warmth that expensive furniture can duplicate but never create. I felt sorry for them, not the pity that weakness deserves, but the compassion that recognizes shared humanity even in people who forget their own. Spring brought new growth in my windowsill herbs and new confidence in my studies. I was selected for an internship with a nonprofit organization that helped domestic workers understand their rights and find resources for escaping exploitative situations. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being paid to help women escape circumstances I had lived through for 8 years. My first client was Maria, a young woman from Uruguay who worked for a Manhattan family that treated her worse than the Whitmores had ever treated me. She slept in a closet, worked 18-hour days, hadn't been paid in 3 months, and was afraid to complain because they threatened to have her deported. Sitting across from Maria in our nonprofit's office, seeing my own former fear reflected in her eyes, I understood why I had needed to survive those 8 years of invisible service. Not because I deserved punishment, but because I needed to understand dignity lost before I could help others find dignity recovered. "You are not invisible," I told Maria in Spanish, using the few words I had learned from Mrs. Rodriguez. "You are not disposable. You deserve to be seen and paid and treated like the human being you are." Over the following months, I helped Maria find a lawyer, document her working conditions, negotiate back pay, and eventually find employment with a family who understood the difference between hiring help and owning people. Watching her transformation from frightened victim to empowered worker was like watching my own story rewritten with intervention and support. 1 year after leaving the Whitmore family, I received an invitation that surprised me. Catherine Whitmore was getting married, and somehow my name had ended up on her guest list. The invitation was addressed to Fatima Ahmad, former household manager, as if my 8 years of service were a previous career rather than survival disguised as employment. I stared at the expensive cardstock with its elegant calligraphy and wondered what response was appropriate. Part of me was curious to see how the family was doing, whether Khalil's legal case had changed their behavior, whether time had taught them lessons about treating people with basic respect. But a larger part of me recognized the invitation as emotional manipulation disguised as inclusion. They wanted me present, not as honored guest, but as evidence of their own generosity, proof they had always treated the help like family, despite years of evidence to the contrary. I sent a polite decline with congratulations for Catherine's happiness. My presence at her wedding wouldn't add joy to her celebration or healing to my past. Some chapters of life are meant to be closed, not revisited for other people's comfort. Instead of attending the wedding, I spent that weekend visiting Omar at his college, where he was studying business administration with plans to help communities develop economic opportunities that didn't depend on exploitation. We walked around his campus, and he introduced me to professors and friends as his mother, not qualifying the relationship with apologies or explanations. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said as we sat in the student union, sharing coffee that tasted like freedom instead of service, not just for leaving that job, but for figuring out what you wanted to do afterward. Not everyone knows how to rebuild their life from scratch. I thought about his words as we drove back to Queens, traffic moving at the same steady pace as reconstruction, progress measured in miles rather than moments. I had rebuilt my life from scratch. But scratch hadn't been empty ground. Scratch had been 8 years of invisible learning about dignity, justice, humanity, and the difference between service and servitude. Now, 2 years later, I wake up each morning in my sun-filled apartment and remember what it feels like to matter in my own life. I work with families who need guidance navigating immigration systems, domestic workers who need support escaping exploitation, and communities that need advocates who understand powerlessness and perseverance. The herbs on my windowsill grow wild and green, reaching toward light without permission or apology. My reflection in the mirror shows a woman who takes up space without shame, speaks at normal volume without fear, and smiles with satisfaction, earned rather than performance required. I still think about the Whitmores sometimes, wondering if they learned anything from Khalil's legal case or if money successfully buffered them from consequences again. I hope their current housekeeper knows her worth better than I knew mine during those 8 years of marble silence. I hope they have learned to see service workers as human beings rather than expensive appliances. But mostly I think about the woman I was and the woman I've become, about invisible years that taught me what visibility means, about stolen dignity that taught me what dignity costs, about service that taught me the difference between helping others and losing yourself in the process. My story isn't unique. Across this country, women wake up every day in basement rooms and attic apartments, cleaning houses and raising children and caring for elderly parents, while their own dreams collect dust in closets they're too tired to open. They send money to families they barely see, serve meals they don't share, and organize lives they're not included in. If you're listening to this story while working for someone who never says thank you, while cleaning up after people who don't see you, while giving your best years to other people's comfort, please hear me when I say this. You are not invisible. You are not disposable. You deserve dignity, recognition, and the chance to matter in your own life. Your service has value, but you have value beyond your service. Your work matters, but you matter more than your work. The families you care for are lucky to have you, and if they don't recognize that luck, the problem is their blindness, not your worth. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever worked for people who treated you like expensive furniture rather than valuable humans? Have you ever given so much of yourself to others that you forgot who you were underneath all that giving? The night I left the Whitmore penthouse, I stood on Fifth Avenue and looked up at the windows where I had spent 8 years becoming smaller and smaller until I almost disappeared. The lights were on, warm and golden, but I felt nothing but relief. Those weren't my lights anymore. They were someone else's responsibility now. I walked to the subway station with my single suitcase, and for the first time in 8 years, I bought a Metro card with my own money for a journey to my own destination. The train was crowded with people coming home from work, tired but visible, struggling but acknowledged, working but not owned. I stood among them and felt like I belonged somewhere again. 3 years have passed since that night, and I've learned things about myself I never knew during those invisible years. I learned that I love teaching, that I'm good with numbers, that I have opinions about politics and art and movies. I learned that I laugh loudly when something is truly funny, that I cry easily during commercials for telephone companies, that I prefer my coffee black and my friendships honest. I learned that my hands are skilled at more than cleaning. They can comfort a crying child, help a trembling elder sign documents, hold space for women who need someone to listen to their stories of survival. I learned that my voice, so long trained to whisper apologies, can also speak truth to power and sing lullabies to my grandchildren who don't exist yet but feel possible now. Omar graduated last month with highest honors, his diploma earned through work and scholarship, and the determination he inherited from both his parents. At his graduation ceremony, I sat in the audience wearing a dress I had bought for myself, in a color I chose because it made me feel beautiful. When they called his name, I clapped and cheered without worrying about being too loud or taking up too much space. After the ceremony, he found me in the crowd and hugged me tight. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered in my ear, "for showing me that it's never too late to choose yourself." I thought about those words as we celebrated at a restaurant where I ordered exactly what I wanted without checking the prices, where I spoke to the server as an equal and tipped generously, because I knew what it felt like to depend on other people's kindness for survival. That evening, as I unlocked the door to my apartment that I rent under my own name with money I earned through work that honors both my skills and my humanity, I realized something profound. I hadn't just escaped the Whitmores. I had found myself. The woman who cleaned their marble floors for 8 years had been real, but she had been incomplete, performing a version of herself that fit into the spaces between other people's lives. The woman I am now is full-sized, taking up appropriate space in her own life, visible to herself and others who matter. Sometimes former clients from the immigration center call to update me on their successes. Maria, the young woman from Uruguay, became a citizen last year and now manages 3 other domestic workers for a cooperative she helped establish. They set their own wages, their own hours, their own terms of dignified employment. "You saved my life," she tells me every time we speak, but I know the truth is more complex. We saved each other by recognizing our shared humanity in circumstances designed to make us invisible. Last week, I received a letter forwarded from my old address at the Whitmore building. The envelope was thick and expensive, with a return address from a law firm in Dubai. Inside was a document in Arabic with English translation attached. Khalil al-Rashid had established a scholarship fund for children of domestic workers, funded by his settlement with the Whitmore family. The letter explained that I had been selected as one of 3 board members who would help decide which students received support for higher education. "Your kindness during my visit to America remained with me," Khalil had written in a personal note attached to the official documents. "I learned later about your situation with this family, and I wanted to honor your humanity by asking you to help ensure other people's children have opportunities their parents earned but couldn't access." I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by thriving herbs and streaming sunlight, holding documents that transformed my 8 years of invisible suffering into visible purpose. The Whitmore family's stolen wealth, recovered through justice and redistributed through generosity, would now fund dreams they had tried to keep buried. The irony was beautiful and perfect. Their money would lift up exactly the kind of people they had spent years looking down on. The hands they had refused to see would now help other hands reach toward education, dignity, and choice. I called Omar to tell him about the scholarship fund, and he laughed with the kind of joy that comes from seeing patterns of justice emerge from chaos. "Mom," he said, "remember when you used to worry that those 8 years were wasted? Look what came from them. You helped a man find justice that helps children find futures. You turned invisible suffering into visible service." That night, I walked through my Queens neighborhood as evening settled over families coming home to each other. Children played in front yards while parents cooked dinner, and grandparents sat on stoops sharing stories and observations. The sounds were human-scaled, laughter and conversation and life happening at the speed of relationship rather than obligation. I thought about the Whitmores in their marble silence, surrounded by expensive beauty but isolated from human connection. I thought about Elizabeth, probably training another housekeeper to be grateful for crumbs and invisible in exchange for stability. I thought about Richard, still chasing numbers on screens while missing the wealth that can't be digitized or traded. I thought about Catherine, Married now, but probably still introducing help as our people, rather than learning their names. And then I stopped thinking about them, because they were no longer my responsibility to understand or forgive or fix. They were just people I had known during a chapter of my life that was finished, characters in a story that happened to me but didn't define me. My reflection smiled back from store windows as I passed, a woman walking with purpose through a neighborhood where she belonged. My hands swung freely at my sides, empty of silver trays and cleaning supplies, available now for more important work, holding those I love, building what matters, reaching toward light. The subway carried me home to an apartment where I would sleep in a bed I had chosen, in a room painted colors that made me happy, surrounded by the peace that comes from being seen and valued by people who matter, including myself. Tomorrow I would wake up early from choice rather than obligation, make coffee exactly the way I like it, and spend my day helping people discover their own worth in systems designed to make them feel worthless. It's work that pays in satisfaction as much as salary, service that honors both giver and receiver, visibility that grows brighter the more it's shared. Tonight, I would call my mother and talk about everything and nothing, the luxury of conversation with someone who has loved me since before I knew I needed to be loved. I would water my herbs and read a book I chose and plan lessons for students who respect my knowledge and experience. I would live fully and visibly in the life I had built from the rubble of years when I forgot I was more than my usefulness to others. The train pulled into my station, and I climbed the steps toward street level, toward air that belonged to everyone and light that included me. Behind me, the city hummed with millions of stories unfolding, some painful, some joyful, all worthy of being witnessed and honored. I walked home through streets where I was known and valued, toward an apartment where I would sleep peacefully in my own bed, surrounded by my own choices, held by my own hard-won understanding of what it means to matter in your own life. This is how liberation looks. One step at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, until the accumulation becomes a life lived with dignity intact and humanity restored. And if somewhere tonight another woman sits in a basement room or an attic apartment, invisible in other people's lives, forgotten by people who benefit from her service, I hope somehow she knows. You are worthy of more than this. You deserve to be seen. Your story matters. You are not alone. The courage to leave might come slowly, in small rebellions and quiet recognitions, but it will come. And when it does, you will discover what I discovered. The woman you were before you learned to disappear is still there, waiting to emerge into light, ready to claim space and voice and choice and all the beautiful, complicated work of living your own life on your own terms. You are not invisible. You never were. You were just surrounded by people who had forgotten how to see. But you can teach yourself to see your own worth, and once you do, everything changes. The story continues, but it's no longer about what happened to me. It's about what becomes possible when we refuse to disappear, when we insist on being seen, when we choose ourselves with the same dedication we once gave to others who never chose us back. That's the real miracle. Not the escape from invisible servitude, but the return to visible selfhood, the reclamation of a life lived with dignity in the light, where everyone can see us for who we really are. If this story reminded you of your own experiences, or someone you know who deserves recognition for invisible years of dedicated service, please share it in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for each other is say, "I see you. Your story matters. You are not alone." If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe. It helps this message reach another woman who works with dedication and heart. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving. You can find it here by clicking on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. I'll see you in the next story.